This is a little wartime story. Now, during World War II and indeed in World War I, Scapa Flow was the main naval base for the Royal Navy. And it was attacked early in the war by both U-boats and aircraft. Bombers came. And at the time that they called the Phony War, the Luftwaffe was bombing the crap out of us here. The first British civilian to be killed in an air raid happened in Stennis, not far from where I am now. Now, one thing that the Luftwaffe did, as well as dropping bombs, was they dropped parachute mines. They would drop these mines with a big silk parachute, and they would land in the sea. And then there was the danger that a ship could hit one and sink. So, the one day, there was a bomber, flew up the Hoy Sound, just next to where I am in Stromness, and they dropped 2 parachute bombs. And these mines landed in the sea, and they had been spotted. And so they were able to go out, minesweepers went out and destroyed the mines. But there was something else that the military authorities wanted, and that was the silk parachutes themselves. Now, they had to be silk because they had to be very strong and very light and be able to be packed really tightly. So it was a valuable material. Also, they wanted to see whether the German parachutes were better than the British ones. Now, they had recovered one parachute, but not the second. And they wondered whether or not it would be washed ashore on either Hoy or Graemsay. So, they went to Graemsay and they said, "Have you seen a parachute washed up on the shore?" "Oh, no," everybody said. No. Haven't seen any parachutes." Well, that wasn't strictly true. They had seen the parachute. They found it on the shore, and they had taken it, and they'd washed it. And there was plans afoot from the women on the island of making underwear for themselves, silk knickers. That would be very lovely. Much better than scratchy wool or linen, So, it was hidden. Now, the military authorities felt that, there was a good chance that it had come ashore on Graemsay and that people knew more than they were letting on. And so they decided to go and search the island. Now, the people had to hide the parachute, but where? Somebody had a great idea. They went to a farm where there was a stag, as we would say, a stallion. And this stallion had a reputation for being feisty, having a very short fuse. And so they locked it up in the stable, they put hay in the rake in front of them, and they hid the parachute in that and they covered it with hay. And then, just to make sure, they got a brush handle and they poked the stallion up the bum with it, until it was absolutely furious, and it was chomping around and kicking, lashing out with its hooves. It was a dangerous beast, and that is the state that it was in when the army guys came to search it. When the soldiers arrived, they looked in the barn, in the stable, and there was the horse, and it was loose in this louse box, and it was jumping around, and it was kicking and neighing, and it was in a terrible state. And they thought, right, not going near that. So they left, and they never did find the parachute. And I can only assume that winter the ladies of Graemsay had very comfortable and very stylish underwear. This is a very ancient story called the Mother of the Sea. Now, it was believed a long time ago that the sea was ruled by spirits. And in the summer, the sea was ruled by the Mother of the Sea. And the Mother of the Sea gave life to all the creatures in the sea, and she calmed the storms so that the water was flat, and it meant that people could go fishing. It was a safe time, and it was a time when there was the most fish and shellfish to be caught, crustaceans, crabs, lobsters. But there was another spirit that also dwelled in the depth of the sea, and that was a creature called Terran. There was a male spirit, but it was the spirit that rules the sea in winter time, and it was a terrible, terrible destructive spirit, and it would create storms that would wreck ships, and people wouldn't be able to go out fishing. And it also drove the fish and all the crustaceans into deeper water, so there was little chance of fishing off the rocks. Now, what happened was that the Mother of the Sea would rule in the summer, but then as the year was passing, she used up all her strength and her energy, all her power was put into generating life in the sea. And she grew weaker and weaker. And as she grew weaker, Terran grew stronger. She had him bound at the bottom of the sea, but he broke his chains then when his power grew, and him and the Mother of the Sea fought. And that is causes the storms at the autumn equinox. And Terran defeats the Mother of the Sea, and he drives her from the ocean. She has to go ashore and live on land. These spirits are invisible to mortal eyes. She probably walks among us, but we wouldn't see her. And then Terran's time comes to rule the sea, and he raises the storms. He drives away the fish and the crabs and the lobsters. And it's a bad time for people. He also unleashes the terrible Nuclavy as well, a hideous monster, half horse, half human. And it would destroy the whole islands of Orkney if it wasn't for the fact that it can't stand the touch of fresh water. It burns it like acid. And so, in the winter time, when there's a lot of rain, it means that he can't come ashore, and that's the only reason why we are safe. But then, as the winter passes, the Mother of the Sea grows in strength again, until she's able at springtime to go down into the sea once more and challenge Terran to fight. She overcomes him and she binds him at the bottom of the sea. She locks up the terrible Nuclavy as well. And then her reign begins, her rule of the sea in the summer, with plenty and peace. But she will weaken, and Terran will grow stronger, and the conflict will carry on, and it will always carry on until the end of time. On the island of Hoy, there's a valley, and it's where you find the Dwarfy staying. It's a rock-cut tomb from about 5,000 years ago, and the cliffs behind it's called the Dwarfy Hammers. And a bit further along, there is a little valley that runs into the hill. It's called the Trowie Glen, named after the Trows, the fairy folk that live there. And this is a story about that very magical place, a place so magical, they've even named it after fairies and dwarfs. This is the Trows of Trowie Glen. Now, Mancy Rich was a young man who lived in Rackwick, the beautiful, beautiful valley facing the sea. It has boulders of striped rocks on the shore, and the sand there is pink, because on either side of it is two huge red sandstone cliffs, and that's what colours the sand. It's beautiful. Now, Mancy had business one day that took him a far, far away down to Longhope. And so he set off early in the morning and he went walking and he concluded his business and he wanted to get home early. He wanted to make sure that he didn't have to travel through the Trowie Glen after dark. So one thing led to another and he got a bit delayed, a bit later than he would have liked. So he had to set off and walk all the way home, and to his horror, it was starting to get dark. The gremlins, we call it in Orkney. The gremlins was on twilight. And as he was approaching Trowie Glen, it was getting darker and darker. And his heart was in his mouth. He was afraid. Now, as he was walking along that valley, he found himself being drawn towards the Trowie Glen. He didn't want to go to Trowie Glen, but he had no choice in the matter. His feet were taking him in that direction, whether he wanted to go or not. And then he realized that he wasn't alone. You see, there was lots of little people walking with him, no bigger than about a foot high, and he knew these to be the fairy folk. And they were drawing up towards Trowie Glen. And when they got there and he went up right to the head of the glen, there was a cave there, and light was pouring out of the cave, and so was music. There was a lovely party going on in there. Well, Tam found himself walking through the door, and there he was stopped by 2 Trowie guards who said, "So, what do you want?" "Well, I don't really know," he says. I'm just here." "Well, you can't pass," they said. "You can't come into the kingdom until you get a passport from himself." Himself? Yeah, himself. He's the boss around here. And before you can come into his kingdom, you have to have a passport with his name on it. So they made him wait, and they went into another room, and then they came back carrying a chair between them, like a throne, which they sat down on the floor, and then a wee man, who was bigger than the rest, he was about 18 inches tall. He came walking in. He was dressed in fine powder blue clothes, and on his head was a white turban. And he said, "Do you know who I am?" "No," said Mancy, "but I'm not scared of you," he lied. "Ha! Well spoken, Mancy," he said. "I'm himself. I'm the chief chield here in the Trowie Glen. And this is my kingdom. And before you can pass into it, you must have a passport with my name on it. But that's not a problem. I can get you that. But I bet you'd be liking a drink after, the long walk." "Well, that I would." "Well, try some of this." And he clapped his hands, and a Trow servant brought him a cog of foaming ale, and he said, "Drink that. It's heather ale. You'll never have tasted anything as good as this in your life before." And sure enough, he took a drink of it, and it was so good. And he felt himself tingling all over, and he wanted to dance. The music was still pouring out of the room next door, and he wanted to go in and join the fun. Well, himself wrote out a passport for him and handed it to him, and the door was open, and he could join the dancers, and they all danced on the floor there. All the little men were dressed in blue, and the little ladies, who were beautiful to look at, they were all dressed in white. And he thought that these little tiny women were so beautiful, and he wanted to dance with them, but there was the height problem for a start. But also, every time he put his hands down to try to grip their hands between his thumb and forefinger, then they just disappeared. They just ran through his fingers like water. He could never touch them. But he still had a good time, and he laughed and he danced and he drank more heather ale, and he was having a lovely time. Well, after a while, he started to think to himself, I'd like a smoke. So he says to himself, would you object if I smoked? Did what? Smoked. What do you mean smoked? Well, smoke a pipe, you know? No. You don't know what a pipe is? You don't know about smoking? No? No, I don't know anything about this. What? Explain. Well, I'll show you, he said. And he took out his clay pipe, and he took out some tobacco, and it was a long twist, a plug of tobacco, and he cut off a chunk of it, and he rubbed it on his palm, and he filled the pipe, and all the little fairy folk were gathering around in amazement to watch this incredible ritual. They'd never seen anything like it before. Now, he then got out his matches, and he struck a match, and he lit it, and he blew big pungent clouds of smoke up into the air, and all the little fairy folk were amazed by such a sight. They'd never seen anything like this before. But then a terrible thing happened. As the smoke started to fill the hall, all the little fairy folk started to cough and hold their throats, and they all started to pass out. They all fainted, lay down on the floor, collapsed, fell over, and poor Mancy was absolutely horrified by what had happened. But by this time it was too late. All the little fairy folk were overcome with the fumes, and they were all passing out and falling on the floor, and the last one to go was himself, who was bigger than the rest of them. Himself collapsed, and as soon as himself went over, there was a noise like a clap of thunder, and the light went from Mancy's eyes, and he fell into a deep swoon. And when he woke up, he discovered that he wasn't in front of a cave. He was in front of a rabbit hole in the Trowie Glen, and not a trow in sight. So, ladies and gentlemen, it just goes to show that smoking can damage your health. I do apologise for that. Now, it was said in the island of Sandy that mermaids didn't always have fishes' tails. The old men believed that they did, but the old women said that they were foolish, and that it wasn't a tail. It was a beautiful petticoat that they could tie over their feet, and it looked like a fish's tail, and they could use it in the sea to propel them like a tail. But when they wanted to, they could untie the strings that drew it up around their feet, and they could open it up, and there was a pair of milk-white feet that they could trip along the sand in. Now, this story was a story that's always I've been very fond of. It comes from the island of Sandy, where my father came from, and it was the name of the first collection of folk tales that I published back in 1998, and it's called The Mermaid Bride. Now, Johnny Croy was the most handsome man in all of Sandy, and he was known for being brave as well. And all the girls fancied him. They all wanted him as their husband, but Johnny wasn't really interested in anybody. He just got along with his life, lived at a little croft called Vollier, and he lived there with his mother. And he worked hard, but he kept himself to himself. Now, lots of the lasses there would have been very happy to have him as their husband, but no matter how much they tried to catch his eye, he just wasn't interested. Now, one day, he went down to the shore below his house. Now, most of Sandy is just, as the name suggests, made of sand. Long white beaches, miles and miles of beautiful white sand. But on this end, down to the south east of the island. It's more rocky, it's higher ground. And he was wandering along there, collecting driftwood for the fire, when he heard a sound, the most beautiful sound that he'd ever heard in his whole life. And he walked very carefully, very slowly along the beach, and the sound got louder and louder as he drew near. Now he hid behind a rock, and he peeped around the corner, and what should he see but a mermaid sitting on a rock, and she was combing her long golden hair with a beautiful golden comb. He could see that she didn't wear anything above the waist, but from the waist down she had a silvery-coloured petticoat, which was twisted at the end to shape like a tail, and it was lying on the shore next to her. And she sat there combing her hair, and as she did, she sang the most beautiful song, the most enchanting song that he'd ever heard in his life. And Johnny knew that there was no way he could have anyone for a wife but this mermaid. He couldn't see her properly. She was side on to him, but just the side of her face was enough to set his heart fluttering. She was a rare beauty. Now, he didn't know what to do. How do you approach a mermaid? Well, he thought and he thought until eventually he had an idea. Then he got down on his belly, and he crawled carefully among the rocks until he got between the mermaid and the sea. But then what? What should he do now? Well, he sneaked up very, very quietly towards her. She was sitting there combing her hair and singing in the sunshine, not with a care in the world. She didn't notice him. Then he sneaked right up to her until he sprang up and he grabbed her. He turned her around and he kissed her on the lips. Well, the mermaid sat there in stunned silence just for a second. It was like she was in a daze. She didn't know what had hit her. And then she pushed Johnny over, and he fell among the rocks, and then the tail of the petticoat had a life of its own, and it swept up and it smacked him on the side of the face, sent him reeling. And she pulled up the petticoat and she ran down to the sea and swam a short distance away. And then she stayed there bobbing up and down in the water, staring at him. Well, Johnny got up and repositioned his jaw a bit, yeah. Oh, that was some belt she gave him. I mean, he was a strong man, and, nobody had ever bettered him before in a struggle of strength, but hats off to the mermaid. He was impressed. She'd flattened him. She'd knocked him into the middle of next week. Yeah, he was impressed. And then he looked at the mermaid, and she stared back at him. And it was almost like fire sparking from her eyes. She was so angry. She was furious. He had dared to kiss her on the lips, without being asked. That was a great breach of protocol. There was no way she could stand that. But there was something else in her eyes, too. It was the first gleam of love. Because mermaids, they are usually on the lookout for a human husband. And that kiss, oh, that kiss. She remembered that. It burned on her lips. That kiss. That man's face, those eyes. Oh, she started to burn with desire for him. Now, Johnny stood there, absolutely dumbstruck, didn't know what to do, didn't know what to say. But then suddenly something caught his eye. Something glinted at his feet in front of him. And when he looked down, what should be lying there among the seaweed but the mermaid's golden comb. He bent down and picked it up. He held it aloft. The sun caught it, a gleam on the gold, and he said to her, "Thank you. Thank you for leaving me this love token, my love." And when she saw that, her eyes grew wide, and she went, "My comb! Oh, please give me my comb back. Oh, alas, alas, I can't go back home, back to the land of the Finn folk, if I don't have my comb with me. I mean, they'll laugh at me. They'll call me the lass that lost her comb. Oh, please give it back. Please, please. I'll do anything you want. Just give me back my comb." "Anything I want," he said. "There's only one thing in the world that I want, my dear." "What's that?" she said. "You," he said. "I want you as my wife. I love you. My heart burns for you. My soul burns for you." Well, the mermaid looked at him and she said, "I would give you my heart, and I would give you my hand in marriage. But you have to come with me. Come beneath the waves with me, and I will take you to the land of Finnfolkheim. Oh, it's a beautiful place. You'll be a very important man there. And you'll live in a beautiful palace made of crystal, and you'll never want for anything in your life again. I will make every day the happiest of your life if you come and live under the sea with me." "No," he said, "no. You must come and live on land with me." "You're not tricking me into going under the sea with you. You might be trying to drown me for all I know." "I'm not," she says. "You will have the power to breathe underwater. I can give you that." "No," he said. "Look, I have a fine peety hoose there. Fine wee fairm. Vollier, it's called. And it's a grand wee hoose, and I've plenty of gear. I have plenty of implements, plenty of furniture. I have coos. I have sheep. Oh, I've got everything you need. There's hens, there's ducks, there's geese. What more could you want? Come and live with me on land and be my wife, and I will love you. I will love you more than you've been loved in your life, more than you could ever imagine." "No," she said. "Come and live under the sea with me. Be an important rich man. Lack for nothing. I can't live on land with you. I can't stand your black rain and your white snow and your frost and the wind the whole time. Oh, and your smoky fires. It would dry me up like a fish hanging above it. No, come and live under the sea with me." Well, the two of them argued back and forth for what seemed like an age. But then the mermaid spotted some people in the distance. Mermaids have got very sharp eyesight. And she turned around and she swam away. Her golden hair flowed over the white, snowy skin on her back. It was like sunbeams dancing on snow. And as she swam away, she sang a lament for her comb. "Oh, alas, alas, for my beautiful comb." And then she sank under the waves, and Johnny didn't see her again. So he went home, taking the comb with him, and he locked it away in a safe place. And he went to bed that night. And he didn't sleep. Waste of time. He might as well have stayed up. He couldn't sleep. All he could think about was the mermaid. If he did manage to, from exhaustion, just, pass out for a short time, he could see nothing but her eyes and hear nothing but her song. There was no way that he could sleep. And in the daytime, he wished it was night again. And he couldn't eat, and he went around the house like a man in a dream. And then at night he wished it was daytime again. Oh, there was nothing that could please him. The only thing in the world that could please him was that beautiful mermaid. Well, his mother saw that there was something far wrong with him, and she said, "What's wrong with you, son? What's wrong?" "Nothing," he said. "I'm fine." No, you're not. I know you. What's wrong with you? Well, if you must know, I've fallen in love. You're in love? Well, that's good news, said the old woman. That's great news. Who is she? I don't know her name. Oh, you don't know her name? But you'll have seen her around. Well, I bet she's seen you too, and I can tell you, all the lasses around here, they would give their back teeth to have you as a husband. You're a handsome man. Yeah, but it's not one of the lasses around here. What? It's no lass for Bornis, is it? No, it's not a lass for Bornis. Oh, well, not so much. Well, who is it then? It's a mermaid. I seen this mermaid sitting on the rocks and she was singing, and it was so beautiful. I just lost my heart and my head to her. There's just nobody in the world that I want other than her. A sea lass, said his mother. You fell in love with a sea lass. All the women in the whole island that you could have fallen in love with, and it's a bloody sea lass. Oh, you gappus. You great gappus fool, you. Fancy falling for a sea lass. I spoke to her. She was wanting me to come and live with her under the sea, but I wanted her to come here. But she dropped her comb, and I picked it up, and I've got it. Where do you have it? Well, it's just sitting next to the bed. That's no good enough. Boy. God's sake, what to do with you? Men. Stupid. Well, I suppose you can't help it. Well, listen. If you really are set on having her as your bride, this is what you have to do. You must hide the comb. You must keep it safe somewhere, safe where she can't find it. As long as you have the comb, you have power over her. But if you ask me, my advice would be to go straight back down to the shore where you seen her and throw that comb as far out into the sea as you can manage. But you're a man, and you'll go your own way, and you'll likely sink in the mire at the end of the road. Well, poor Johnny. That night he was in bed, and he was tossing and turning, and he couldn't sleep. And in his mind he could hear the sound of the song, the singing of the mermaid. It was beautiful, and so real, just like it was in the room with him. And then his eyes flickered open, and he still heard the sound of the song, the beautiful song of the mermaid. And he looked down at the end of the bed, and there she was, sitting on the end of the bed, and singing the beautiful song of enchantment, the song that had reeled him in, that had stolen his heart. Well, she said, I've come to see you, and to make that offer again. Come and live with me under the sea, and I'll make you a great man. No, he said, live on land with me, live at Volure here, and I will love you every day. I will treat you like a queen. But I can treat you like a king with the riches we have under the sea. You don't have anything like that here. No, I can't leave the land. I can't go under the sea. You must come and stay here. Well, okay. I'll do a deal with you. Give me back my comb, and I promise I will marry you. I swear to you an oath so binding that there is no way I could break it. I will marry you, and I will live on land with you for 7 years. But at the end of 7 years, we have to go with everything that I own, everything that I have in the world, has to go back to the sea to visit my family. Would you do that? Yes, I will. He went down on his knees on the floor and he swore on the moorstein that he would give her his word, that he would marry her and she would live there for 7 years, and then he would go with her and everything that she had under the sea. Well, finally the day came when they were to be wed. And there was never a more beautiful bride on all the broken islands of Orkney than that mermaid. Her golden hair was combed out and hung loose over her shoulders. It sparkled in the sun like spun gold. The dress she wore was white, but it was flecked with silver gold, an iridescence like a pearl. And around her neck she wore a string of pearls, and each pearl was as big as a cockle shell. When the minister stood up in front of them and started to preach a sermon, the mermaid stuffed her hair into her ears. You see, the mermaids and all those supernatural creatures, they don't like the word of God. Some say they're in league with the devil, but they certainly don't like the sound of preaching. And she stuffed her hair in her ears to drown out the voice of the minister. And then the ring was slipped on her finger, and they kissed. Now time passed, and she lived with them at Folklore, and they were very, very happy. And every year a new bairn was born. 7 bairns, the finest looking bairns that had ever been seen on the island of Sandy. Now the youngest was just a baby when the time was passing near to the time when they were meant to go back to the sea, back to visit her family. And to give them a bit of room, Johnny's mother had had a small cottage built near to theirs. And she lived there, and she used to nurse the babies. She would take them up there, and she would care for them. And the youngest one was there now in a cradle, being cared for by her granny. And the mermaid started to clean and started to pack things, getting ready for a journey. She'd come from the sea with some beautiful blue cattle, and they were all brushed and prepared and ready to go as well. A boat was prepared, and Johnny, well, he thought plenty, but he said little. And soon the day came when they were due to go. The boat was ready, and some of the mermaid's family, some of the finfolk, came out of the sea to help with the moving. They went up to the house and they took everything that belonged to the mermaid and took it down to the boat. The cattle were rounded up as well. And Johnny and his 6 oldest bairns were sitting in the boat. The mermaid went down to join them. Now, the Finn men had gone up to the granny's house to fetch the youngest bairn. But they came down with a look of bemusement on their face. "Where's the bairn?" she said. "Well, I don't know. We tried to lift up the cradle, but we couldn't budge it an inch. Even 4 of us, 1 on each corner, couldn't move it. It's only a very small baby," she says. "I know, but that cradle could weigh tons. We can't move it." And then a black look went over her face, and she went up to the house. Well, she pulled back the blankets and she touched the bairn, and it was as if she was burnt. She screamed and leapt back, and the old woman laughed. Now, you see, people said that old woman, she knew a thing or two. She was a spae wife, a witch. She knew magic. And that night, the night before, at midnight, she had built up her fire with peats, and she had taken a piece of just a piece of wire, metal wire, and she twisted it into the shape of a cross, and she heated it up over the fire. And then she pulled back the blankets and turned the bairn over, and she branded it on the backside with the mark of the cross, and the bairn screamed like a demon, but he was marked for life with a cross, and no mermaid or fin man could touch him, and there was no way he could ever travel down to their world when he was marked with a cross. The mermaid's beautiful face was flooded with tears, and she turned and walked slowly down to the boat, saying, "Alas, alas for my bonny wee boy, that he has to live and die on land like a mortal." And Granny, the tears ran down her face as well, but there was a laugh hanging about her lips. The Finfolk pushed that boat out into the sea, and they sailed away. And Johnny Croy, his bairns, and his Mermaid Bride were never seen again on the island of Sandy. But that boy grew up to be a strong, handsome man, every bit as handsome and strong as his father, actually a lot more, because he had that mermaid blood in him. And after his granny died, he took up the sword for a living. They said that he went to the Holy Land in one of the Crusades and fought there, and he amassed a great wealth, a great treasure. And they say that he married a Jarl's daughter and lived very happily for the rest of his days. But as for Johnny and his Mermaid Bride and his brothers and sisters, this story has no more to say about them. This story was said to be the most popular story in Orkney in the 19th century, so the collector Walter Trell Dennison said anyway. It's called The Selkie That Didna Forget. Now there was once a man that lived on Sandy, called Tom Muir. And Mancy was a crofter, a fisherman. Now, the one day, he was down by the shore, when he heard a noise, a sound, a terrible, wailing, moaning sound, like a woman in distress. So he quickly headed along the shore towards the sound, and he could hear that it came in from a small geo, a little ravine that ran in through the cliff. And he headed towards where all this terrible moaning and groaning sounds was coming from. And then he saw at the end of the geo there was a Selkie. And this Selkie was having pups. She was giving birth. That's why all the groaning and the moans were coming from. Now he saw that there was another Selkie, a male Selkie, was out in the sea. And it was keeping its distance. It wasn't coming into the shore. It was bobbing up and down, and it was watching Mancy to see what he was going to do, but it wouldn't come too close. Well, he watched for a while, and the Selkie had her pups. She had 2 pups. Very unusual. Both bonny pretty white pups. Bonny white skins. And Mancy started to think to himself, there's that lass Maggie that I fancy. If I was to kill those pups and skin them and make a waistcoat out of those white pelts, I would look so good. Then maybe Maggie would see me, and maybe she'd talk to me, and maybe would have a dance. You never know. So he decided that he was going to have those pups. And he went down to the shore towards them. Well, when the female Selkie seen him coming, she managed to get into the sea, but these pretty grey seal pups, they can't go into the water until they've shed their white coat. so they were stranded on the rocks. Well, Mancy ran over to them and he picked up the two wee pups and held them close to him, and he turned around to walk away. Well, the noise that poor female Selkie made. She moaned and groaned, she splashed about in the water, she rose up, she climbed halfway up onto the rocks. She was in a terrible state. And he looked at her, and she was absolutely thrashing around, distraught, staring at her pups. And Mancy could have sworn that there were tears in her eyes streaming down her cheeks. Well, then, when he turned around to go away for the last time, he heard the most terrible, heart-breaking groan come from that Selkie. It was a groan of utter despair. It came from the depths, from way down in some very dark place. And it was so heartbreaking that it just touched Mancy's heart. And he looked down at the two wee pups, and they were nuzzling into his jacket and trying to suck him like he was their mother. And he thought, I can't do it. I can't do this. I'm going to have to give them back to her. So he went down over the rocks, and he set the two wee pups on the rock, just where it was overhanging the sea, and the Selkie came up, and she clasped those pups to her breast. And she looked up into Mancy's eyes, and if that Selkie could have spoken, she would have said, thank you. Thank you for sparing my children. Thank you for giving me back my babies. But, of course, she couldn't speak. But the look in her eyes said it all. There was gratitude in there. And it seemed that she was saying to him, one good turn deserves another. Maybe someday I can help you. Well, Mancy set off and he went home. And he didn't have his white Selkie pup waistcoat to wear to the harvest home, but when he went, well, he managed to get the courage up to go and speak to Maggie, and she spoke to him, and they danced, and then they laughed, and he walked her home. And it was the start of a love affair that lasted for the rest of their lives, as well as a really great friendship, too. The two of them were married. They had a family. The family grew up. They got married, left home. They had a family too. It left Mancy and his wife alone. Now they moved at that time from Sandy to the island of Eddie. And they were living on the west side of Eddie, where there wasn't too many folk living. Now there was nothing that old Mancy liked better than to go fishing. And he had a rock that he particularly favoured. This rock was out in the sea, a bit of a distance, and it was only uncovered at low tide, so he could only get there at low tide. Well, he went down the one night and he started to fish, and there was nothing. He didn't get a thing, not a bite. And he stood there for ages, and he was just starting to think, it's about time to go home. But the tide had turned. The tide had turned, and when the tide turned, the fish came in, and they started to bite. And soon Mancy was hauling them up, about as fast as he could bait a hook and throw it in the sea. There was a fish on the end of it, and he was pulling them up and putting them in his basket. He had a straw basket, a cubby with him to put the fish in. So he was filling up his basket with fish until in the end there was no room for another fish. The basket was full. So he smiled contentedly to himself. He'd had a good night's fishing and he was happy about that. These fish he would eat, and the ones that they couldn't eat fresh, they would split them, dry them, salt them. They would preserve them. They would be food for the winter. So then he turned around to go home. And then he realized what had happened. He'd been so intent on his fishing, he'd forgot about the tide. And the sea had turned, and the tide had come in, and he was now cut off from land. So he thought, well, the water is too deep for me to make it to shore. And he couldn't swim, like most people in Orkney. In those days, he couldn't swim. So he was stuck. So he shouted, "Help! Help!" But nobody came. Nobody heard him. He was in a place that was away from where people lived. No one heard his cries for help. "Help! Help! Help!" he cried. Not a thing. Nobody came. Nobody noticed. Well, poor Mansi. He cried, and the water rose higher and higher until it came up over the rock where he was standing. "Help!" he shouted, but the sea rose over the rock, up to his knees, and nobody heard him. "Help! Help!" he shouted. The water rose up to his waist, and then up to his chest, and he was still shouting, but by now his voice was almost gone, hoarse from shouting. "Help! Help!" he shouted. Nobody heard. Not a thing. The water rose up to his chin, and he could feel himself being lifted off the rock by the sea. And as the little riplets of water was starting to play around his mouth, poor old Mansi thought, well, that's me had it. What a stupid thing I did. I forgot to keep an eye on the tide. So that's me, gone. Suddenly, something grabbed him by the back of the neck. He had no idea what, but something grabbed him forcibly and swept him up off his feet. He was turned around and he was pushed back towards the shore. He carried on going, being pushed by some force that he didn't know what. But eventually he found his feet, finding shore under him. He found the rocks. The water was getting shallower. He was able to touch the bottom. And soon he was able to scramble ashore, soaking wet but alive. And he turned around to see what had happened, see who had saved him. And he saw a seal, a big seal, swimming away in the distance. It swam out to where the rock was, and it dived, and it came back up, and in its mouth it was holding the basket of fish. It swam into the shallows until Mansi was able to wade down through the water and grip the basket and take it ashore with his catch safe and sound. And then he looked into the eyes of the Selkie. There was an old Selkie. He could see that. A Selkie that had seen many, many winters, just like him now. But there was a look in that Selkie's eyes that he remembered. He recognized. He knew that this was the Selkie, whose pups he had spared all those years ago in Sandy. And she gave him such a happy look, like she was saying, one good turn deserves another, and I have repaid my debt to you. And with that she turned around and swam away. And Mansi shouted out after her, God bless the Selkie that didna forget. This is a true story for the island of Westray, where my mother came from. And I've heard the story for her, and I've seen it for other folk too, of course. But there was a wee connection between that and my family as well, which I'll tell you at the end. It's a story called The Wreck of the Archangel. Now, it was in the 1730s on the island of Westray, and there was a terrible gale blowing. And at the wee cottages of Selkie, the Rendell woman that lived there, Rendell was their surname, she sat by the fire, and with a little bit of light that came from the cruisy lamp, she was busy knitting away and trying to keep warm, when the door opened, and in came her husband, and he said, "There's a big ship heading towards the rocks down at Ramageo. I'm going to go next door and get chock of wheeling stains and go down and see if there's anything we can do." "We'll be careful," she said. "It's no a night to be out on." "Aye, I ken," he says. "I ken, lass. I'll take care." And sure enough, he gied next door to get the neighbour, and he gied down to the shore. And there was the ship, and she was in a terrible condition. Some of the masts had snapped, and the sails were torn, and she was completely at the mercy of the tide, and she was being drawn towards the skerries, towards the rocks. And there was not a thing that the people could do. They could just watch on helpless, but there was no way that they could have launched a small boat and got out to that ship that night. Now, on board the ship, the crew were panicking. They were running around frantically. They knew that their last day had dawned. And on the ship there was a woman, and she had a small boy, a wee bairn. Now, this woman, well, people say it was the captain's wife, but I don't know how they could know that. But this woman knew that the ship was doomed. There was not a thing that they could do to save themselves. And so she decided that rather than stay on a splintering, shattered ship, she would take her chances in the roaring sea. And she tied her wee son close to her breast, using her shawl. She tied him tight, and then she chomped over the side of the ship into the foaming, raging sea. At that moment, the ship struck the rocks, and it tore the side out of that vessel, and the waves pounded it, and it was broken to matchsticks. Now, the folk standing on the shore couldn't do a thing to help. They just stood and watched, utterly helpless. And eventually, as it was dark, they went home. Well, the next morning, when the sun rose, they were back at the shore again. They knew that nobody could have survived in that sea. So they were down to see what they could glean from the wreck. You know, one person's disaster is another one's good fortune. There's no trees on Westray. There's no wood. Wood is scarce. So a broken-up ship would provide timber that you could make all sorts of things from. Everything from a cradle to a bed to a coffin would be made from the wood. And also there was sailcloth and rope to be picked up, which were very useful as well. And whatever cargo the ship was carrying. Anything that was of any use was carried up above the high water mark and laid there. That means you'd claimed it. To take anything from above high water mark is tantamount to theft. That's how I was brought up too. Well, every now and again they would find a body, usually in a bad state, mangled with the terrible waves beating on the rock. And they would pull the body up for a decent burial later. You never buried the dead from the sea, the sailors. They were never buried in the kirkyard. The sea claims its prey, and the sea will come and try to flood the kirkyard to get them back, so you bury dead sailors by the side of the shore. You bury them on the links, and that's what they were going to do. Now, the man of Selkie was wandering along when he saw, lying there in the surf, there was another body. And when he went over to look, it was a woman. And he thought, it's a terrible thing, the sea. And then he noticed, worse than ever, there was a small child tied to her. And that touched his heart. And then the bairn made a slight noise, just faint but a slight cry. And the man untied the shawl and he took the bairn up, and it was alive, only just. But it was alive, unlike its mother. And so he ran with the bairn back to Selkie, back as fast as he could, and he gave it to his wife. And she got the bairn stripped down, she dried him off, she wrapped him in blankets and sat him by the side of the fire to warm up. She rubbed his wee feet and hands to get the warmth back into him. She warmed up some milk and gave it to him to drink. Now, they didn't know anything about this child. They had no idea who he was, where he came from. They knew nothing about the ship. And if he could speak any words at all, this wee boy, it was not in a language that was understood to anybody in Westray. The only clue of the ship was that the man of Selkie had found a piece of wood and had writing on it. But that didn't help him much because he was illiterate. So he brought it to the minister to read. The minister looked at it and said, "It says Archangel. It must have been a Russian ship. This must have been its port of registration. Archangel, in the north of Russia." Well, that gave the man something, because they didn't know who this wee boy was. They didn't know what his name was. But the ship had given him a name, and they called him Archangel. And Archangel grew up to be a fine, strong young man. And he married and had a family. And for a long time after that, there were angels in the island of Westray. Now, that's normally where the story finishes, but my mother was born in Westray in 1922. So her parents were born in the 1880s, my grandparents. I was born in 1963. I was an afterthought, old enough to have known better, as I always say. But anyway, my grandparents were born in the 1880s. And my grandfather, Geordie Draver, was a crofter, and he was a fisherman as well. He went out to sea in a boat. And they said that he knew the sea, he could read the sky. He had a great depth of knowledge, which is all long gone now. Anyway, the last person to bear the name of Angel in Westray was a woman called Mary Angel. Now, there had been a lot of girls in the family, so they were married, they had families of their own, but the name Angel had died out. Mary was the last. And when she married a man called Henry Mason, then the name disappeared from the families in Westray. Now, my mother used to say that Mary Angel was what she described as a corset body. My mental picture always of her was Boris Yeltsin in a headscarf and pinny. Now, she had a son, also called Henry, who was at school with my grandfather, Geordie Draver. They were in the same class together. Now, at that time, they had a teacher who was very, very strict. And if they did anything that he didn't approve of, if they stepped out of line just so much as a tiny bit, then he would take them, keep them in after school and make them do extra work. Detention, they call it these days. I don't know what they called it. Probably nothing as polite as that, though, the bairns. But they were sitting there doing arithmetic with the slates and the slate pencils, and they're all going scratching away on their slate and then rubbing it out if they make a mistake, when they could hear a mutter, 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 mutter coming up the close. And the door opens and in walks Mary Angel. And she says to the teacher, "Where's me boy?" "He is being kept back," said the teacher, "because they have been bad today, so they are being punished. "Well, his tea's ready," she said. And she went to get her son. Now the teacher, educated man though he was, did a very stupid thing, because any fool knows that you do not get between a wild animal and its young. And that's what he did. He got in front of the bairn and tried to stop Mary Angel. Mary just up with her fist and smacked him in the face. Down he went like a sack of tatties. Well, that wasn't enough for Mary. Oh, no. She got him by the scruff of the neck, and she dadded his head off the floor until she knocked him out, stone cold. And then she grabbed the bairn by the arm and dragged him out the door and slammed it. The bairns were horrified. "Oh, my God, Mary Angel's killed the teacher. What sort of detention will we get for that?" They had pictures of themselves, these boys with long flowing beards, still doing long division on their slates. Well, he was lying there, a trickle of blood coming out of his ear. And one of the boys, who was slightly braver than the others, went and got a glass of water and splashed it on the man's face. The teacher's eyes flickered open, and in a weak voice he said, "Get me a glass of water, boys." So they went and they got him a glass of water, and he took a drink and he said, "Class dismissed." Well, they didn't need a second telling. They were out that door like a shot. And after that, Mary Angel became a bit of a hero among the bairns in Westry, because, you see, after that teacher never kept them back in detention again. This is an old story from Orkney, and it's called How the Mermaid Got Her Tail. Now, a long time ago, there was a woman who was walking along the shore. Some people say that it was Mother Eve herself who was walking there with some of her attendants. And as she walked along the shore, she had a voice, a beautiful song on the air, a most gorgeous, beautiful, lilting song. When they went a bit nearer, they saw that it was coming from a beautiful, beautiful woman who sat on a rock, combing her long golden hair, and she wore not a stitch of clothes on her body. Now Eve was jealous of this woman's beauty, and so she got her attendants to go and fetch them a dress. And she went over to this creature, this beautiful woman, and she offered her the dress and said, "Maybe you would like to cover yourself up with this. Maybe you would like this dress to wear." And the beautiful woman looked down at the dress and looked at Eve and her followers, and she said, "I'm the Queen of the Sea, and Mermaid's my name. To show me fair body, I dinna think shame. No clays file my skin, no dress will I wear, but the braw tates o' me bonny hair." A tate is just a handful of something that you can hold, like hair or straw. And that's what she meant. She would wear no dress other than her own hair. Well, when Eve heard that, she wasn't very happy at all, so she went to see God to complain to him. She said, "Look, God, there's this woman down there, this mermaid, sitting on the rocks down there, combing her long golden hair with a golden comb, and not wearing a stitch of clothes, and so beautiful that she puts the rest of us to shame. And with her around, if there's any more like her, then, well, men will not look at us. They won't bother with mortal women like us. They will be after all these mermaids, so I want you to give her a fish's tail. That will put men off." Well, God thought this was a bit harsh, but, Eve nagged, and so in the end God said, "Oh, okay. I will make the mermaid wear a tail." But the men who knew what was going on here, they had a different idea, and they craved a boon for the mermaid, a little clause to be added to this contract, and that was that if a mortal man fell in love with a mermaid, then she had the power to take off her fish's tail for good, and to regain back her beautiful long slender legs that she had originally. And God agreed, and that is why mermaids are always on the lookout for a human husband. This is an old tale from Orkney, and it's called Hildaland. Now, there was once a man who lived in the North Isles, and he had a small croft house. So he was a farmer, but he was also a fisherman. He spent a lot of time at sea with him and his sons fishing. It's what put food on the table. Well, he had a daughter as well, and he used to send her down to the shore to gather shellfish for the bait to put on the hooks that he used for catching the fish. And one day she went down to the shore with her bucket in her hand, and she never came home. Now, the old man grew worried when she didn't come back, so he went down to the shore to look for her, but there was no sign of her. The bucket was lying on the shore, and the shellfish that was in it, all the limpets she'd been knocking from the rocks, they were scattered over the shore, but there was no sign of her. Now, the man thought that she must have fallen in the sea and been drowned. And being a fisherman, he knew all the tides in that area, so if her body was in the sea, he knew that it would be washed ashore at a ness just a bit further up, a headland. And every time the tide turned, he would go down and search for his daughter, but she never came ashore. Now, years passed, and the man was at sea one day with his 3 sons, and they were fishing as usual, when the fog came rolling in. Now, that's something that happens a lot in Orkney in the summer. If you get a hot day, you will get fog on the back of it, because the warm air from the land mixes with the cold air from the North Sea, and it turns to fog. And it can roll in really fast, and if you're at sea in a small boat, that can be dangerous, because you don't know where you are. You might end up drifting out into the open ocean when the fog lifts, no sign of land. Or you could hit a rock, hit a skerry, and sink. You had to be careful. And the old man was being very, very careful. He was going back and forth very slowly, just looking to see if they could see any sign of land. Eventually, they could see something dark in the distance, so they headed towards it. And it was an island. So they pulled their boat up on a fine gravelly beach, and they looked around, but they didn't recognize the place. They didn't know where they were. The only thing that they could see was a path. Well, a path's got to lead somewhere, the old man thought. So he followed it, with his sons trailing behind him. And he walked until the path led him to a great big house. I mean, it was huge. It was far bigger than the laird's house and much more impressive. So he went up to the door and he knocked. And the door opened, and who should answer it but his daughter, the girl that he'd given up for lost years before. Oh, he was so pleased to see her. "Well, what are you doing here?" he said. "Come in," she said, "and I'll tell you." So he went in with his sons behind him, her brothers. And you know, if the outside of the house was impressive, the inside was even more beautiful. There was fine tapestries hanging on the walls. There was carpets on the floors. There was fine furniture everywhere. And wherever you looked, there was the glint of gold and silver. Well, his daughter took him into a big room where there was a fire blazing, and they stood in front of it and warmed themselves up a bit. "So how come did you end up here?" "Well," she said, this is where I live. This is my home." "This is your home?" "Oh, yeah." "You see, what happened," she said, "was that, all those years ago, I went down to the shore to gather shellfish for bait. But I forgot what you had always warned me, and I turned my back to the sea. And a Finn man came out of the sea, and he grabbed me, and I got such a shock, I forgot to ask a blessing on myself. If I had said God be aboot me and protect me, then the Finn man would have lost his power, but I was so scared, I forgot everything about that. And he pulled me into his boat, and he pulled on the oar, and the boat shot across the surface of the sea at a tremendous speed, and he took me to this island. And this is where I've been living ever since. It's one of their magical islands, an island that no human can usually see. It's usually hidden from mortal gaze. This is Hildaland, the hidden, glimmering mirage islands that you can sometimes see in the summer. Well, these ones were no mirage. This one was real. "You'll meet my husband soon," he said. We're married now. And he'll be coming home for his tea. So you'll meet him." Now, after a while, the door opened and in came the Finn man, a tall man, black hair and a black moustache and beard. And when he saw them, his wife said, "This is my father and my brothers. They've come to visit." "Oh, wonderful," said the Finn man. "Oh, that's good. You're very welcome in my home," he said. Well, the old man and the Finn man were chatting away together for a while, and the old man was always trying to find out where this island was, but every time he raised that in the conversation, the old man just steered the conversation in a different direction, and he never gave him a clue as to where the island was. But eventually, the Finn man said, "Tell me, you wouldn't have any cattle to sell, would you?" "Oh, yeah," he says, I've got a very fine coo, the best coo I have in the byre. Her name's Brenda, and I was going to sell her at the market. But I'll save you the bother," said the Finn man. "I'll buy her from you, and I'll give you a good price for her too." And he handed him a bag. And when the farmer looked inside it, it was full of gold coins. It was a fortune. But then the old man had an idea. Now he could find out where the island was. So he said to the Finn man, "Tell me, what island is this, so that I know where to bring the coo?" "Ah, you don't need to worry about that," he said. I'll come and fetch her myself. And I think that tea's ready now, a wee bite of supper." And sure enough, there was a fine meal spread on the table. It was a meal of fish. Well, this man was a fisherman. He was used to eating fish. But these fish, oh my word, they were just so wonderful. The taste was so good. He'd never tasted fish like this in his life before. "Where did you get these fish?" he asked. "You'd be surprised," said the Finn man. "Not far from where you live, actually." So they ate their fill. And eventually, one of the sons looked out the window and he said, "I think the fog's starting to lift, Dad." And the Finn man said, "Yeah, the fog's lifting now and it's safe for you to go." So they got up to say their goodbyes, and as they were heading to the door, the man's daughter said to her father, "Father, is there anything in the house here that you may want to take home with you? Any treasure in the house that you would like to take home? Well, the old man smiled, and his daughter smiled back, and he said, yes, there is a treasure in this house I would like to take home with me. And the Finn man said, just name it, and it's yours. Anything you like, you have my word. So the father smiled at his daughter again, and his daughter smiled back to him. And the man said, you see that big gold dish on the dresser over there? Take it, said the Finn man. It's yours. Well, the poor girl, she was a bit crestfallen about that, because, well, obviously she thought that he would choose her. But, I think that the old man reckoned that she was doing okay for herself. If she had come back with him, then, well, there was never always enough to eat, and life was hard. The work was hard and long. And she had a pretty good life there, so he had reckoned that she was probably better off where she was. So they walked down to the boat, and when they got near there, his daughter said to her father, Father, I have a gift for you. Take this. And she gave him a knife. It was a knife with a beautifully carved handle, made out of some sea monster tusk. And she said, keep this knife. Keep it close, keep it safe. And as long as you have this knife, you will have the power to see this island, and you can come and visit me. He thanked her, and they went down to the boat. The Finn man said, just pull in that direction, and you'll be home in no time. They pushed the boat down into the sea, and the old man jumped over the stern of the boat, and as he did so, the knife slipped from his grasp, and it fell into the sea with a plop, and sank to the bottom, and he never seen it again. Now, the next thing that they knew, they were completely engulfed in fog again. Absolutely no sign of anything on either side of them. But in no time at all they sailed out to the bank of fog, and there in front of them was their own house. They were right in the bay, right below their own house. There was the boat noust where they pulled the boat up into, and there was the house. So they headed ashore, they pulled the boat up into the noust, and they headed back home. Now they were met by the old woman, the man's wife, and she came out, and she was in a terrible state, and she was going, oh, thank God you're safe. I'm so worried about you. That fog came in. I thought you'd be lost. We were fine, said her husband. We were fine. Well, I'll tell you something that's no so fine, she said. What's that? Well, it's Brenda, we're cool. What about her? Well, she's gone. Gone? What do you mean gone? Well, gone. What other kind of gones do you get? Gone, as in not there anymore. I went out to the buyer, and the other coos there, but Brenda's gone. And then the old man realized that the Finn man had used his magic, because Finn men are powerful sorcerers, and he'd used his magic to come and spirit away the coo. Don't worry about her, he said. Let her go. She was well paid for. And he showed her the bag of gold coins and the dish, and he told her about the house with the Finn man and their daughter, who was still alive and safe and well. Probably didn't mention the bit about being able to take her home, but, So after that, they had plenty of money. They had a lot of gold, and they were able to build themselves a better house. And they never had to go hungry again. And after that, when the old man went fishing, it was because he enjoyed fishing, not because he had to. But the thing was, he'd lost that knife. And so, no matter how hard he tried, no matter how many times he tried, he never saw that island again. And he never saw his daughter. So, I don't think that he was so rich after all. Do you? There was once a farmer who lived in the west mainland of Orkney, and he fell in love with a lass for the tune of Kirkwall, and he married her and took her back to live with him on his farm. Now the woman was very happy there, but there was one thing that troubled her. You see, the farmer had a very unusual servant. He had a Trow for a servant, one of the fairy folk. And this poor wee Trow was dressed all in rags. So it didn't matter whether it was summer or winter, it went around with the same ragged clothes full of holes, and she felt sorry for it. Didn't even have a pair of boots on its feet or nothing. One day she decided that she would do it a kindness. She would make it a fine new suit of clothes. So she got some cloth, and she made it a wee shirt, and a pair of trousers, and a nice wee waistcoat, and a jacket. She knitted it stockings. She even managed to get a small pair of boots, just bairn's boots, but they would fit him, she thought. She even managed to make him a nice wee hat, a tall hat with a buckle on it, very smart. And then she left it in the kitchen, where the poor Trow came in every night to get a bowl of porridge. And that was the only payment that he ever received, was just a bowl of porridge every night. So she laid out the fine new suit of clothes alongside the bowl of porridge, and then she went to bed. And soon she was sleeping happily, happy in the good deed that she'd done. Now during the night she was woken up with a woohoo, yee, hello, hey. What was that? So her and her husband got up, and they went through to the kitchen, and there was the Trow, standing dressed in his fine new suit of clothes. And he said to them, "Look at me, I'm a gentleman now, I'm far too good to work for the likes of you." And he walked out the door, and he never came back, because he thought that he was something rather special now. And the farmer, well, he was a bit upset at losing his best servant and cheapest servant that he would ever have. But still, he couldn't help loving his wife just that bit more because of her kindness. There was once a king and a queen who had a daughter called Anne, and she was a lovely little girl. They loved her very much. But one day a sad thing happened because the queen died, and it left the king and the little girl all alone. Now after a while, the king remarried, and the woman that he married was not a nice person. And she had a daughter as well, and the daughter was called Kate. Only people used to call her Kate Crackernuts, because she used to like sitting by the fire, cracking nuts and eating them. Now, Kate and her sister, her stepsister Anne, they loved each other very much, and they played together when they were bairns. They ran and they laughed. They loved each other like sisters. Well, they were sisters. And it showed. They loved each other so much. And the king used to smile and laugh when he saw his little girl smiling and laughing too. And he was very happy with his little stepdaughter, Kate. She brought so much happiness into the home. But somebody wasn't happy. Oh no, somebody wasn't happy at all. It was the new queen. Kate's mother. She had a reputation of dabbling in sorcery, magic, and she was jealous of Anne because little Anne was prettier than her daughter Kate. Kate was pretty too, but Anne was really beautiful. And the Queen didn't like that at all, not one little bit, and so she decided that she would try to use the black arts, terrible magic, to try to ruin the little girl's looks, so that nobody would look on her and say that she was prettier than her daughter ever again. She went to see the hen wife. Now, the hen wife kept the chickens that provided the eggs for the castle. And it was well known that the hen wife was a witch, a black witch, an evil witch. Now, one morning the Queen went up to Anne's bedroom and she woke the girl up and she said, "I want you to run down to the hen wife's house and get some eggs for our breakfast." Well, Anne was a really helpful, happy little girl, and she said, "Yes, of course I'll go." She did think it was a bit strange, mind you, because they had servants to go for eggs. But she was eager to please, so she took the basket and she went down the stairs. Now, before she headed to the hen wife's house, I should have said that the hen wife had told the Queen to send the girl down to her, but to make sure that she hadn't eaten anything that day. But that morning, when little Anne was running down the stairs, she passed the kitchen, and she could smell the new baked bread. And she went inside, and the cook gave her a piece of bread with strawberry jam on it. And she ate that as she ran down the road. She went to the little tumble-down shack where the hen wife lived, and she knocked on the door. "Come in," said a voice. She opened the door, and it was very dark inside, but at the far end there was a light from a small fire, and over it there was a big cauldron bubbling away. "Come in," she said. "Come in." "My mum sent me down to get some eggs," said the princess. "Oh, has she indeed?" "Go over and lift the lid on the pot," she says, "and look inside and see what you see." So the little girl went over to the pot. She lifted the lid, she looked inside, but it was just soup bubbling away. The hen wife stared at her, and she wasn't very happy, and she says, "Go home and tell your mother to keep a closer eye on you the next day. Keep the press closed." That's the cupboard where they kept the food. So she didn't know what she meant, but she went home and she told the Queen that what the hen wife had said, and the Queen was very angry. She took the eggs and went off. Well, the next morning the Queen went back up and woke up Anne again and gave her the basket and says, "Go down to the hen wife and get some eggs for our breakfast." But this time, to make sure that the girl didn't eat anything before she left the castle, the stepmother accompanied little Princess Anne down the stairs and out the side door of the castle, and she saw her walking down the road, and then she went back inside. Now, as Anne was walking down the road, she passed a field where there were people working. They were gathering peas. And they said to her, "Would you like some peas, Princess?" "Oh, I'd love some peas," she said. So they gave her some pods of peas, and she popped them, and she ate the peas that were inside. And then she went down to the hen wife's house, this horrible little hovel, and knocked on the door. And the voice said, "Come in." So she went inside, and again it was gloomy and dark, just a small fire at the end with this pot bubbling away over it. "Lift the lid of the pot and see what you see," she said. So Anne lifted the lid of the pot and looked inside, but it was just soup bubbling away. Nothing more than that. The hen wife was not happy. Go home and tell your mother to keep a closer eye on you the next day." So she went home with the message. The queen again wasn't happy, took the eggs, went away. And the third morning she came up and woke the little princess up. "I want you to go down and get eggs from the hen wife." But this time, instead of just seeing her out the castle, the wicked stepmother, the queen, followed her all the way down the road and made sure that she didn't have a mouthful to eat. Not a crust, not a thing. So they went down to the cottage and they knocked on the door. "Come in," said the voice. In they went, dark, gloomy, fire at the end, cauldron bubbling over it. "Lift the lid," said the hen wife, "and see what you see." So Anne lifted the lid of the pot a third time and looked inside, and again it was just soup bubbling away. But suddenly a head rose up out of the soup. It was a sheep's head. She looked into the eyes of the sheep looked into her eyes, and then, suddenly, bump, her own beautiful head fell off her shoulders onto the floor, and the sheep's head jumped out of the pot and stuck on her neck. She was standing there with a sheep's head, and the hen wife and the wicked queen laughed and laughed. They cackled with laughter. And poor Anne wanted to cry, but all she could do was ba, 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 bleat. Oh, the poor girl. Well, the queen took her home, and the poor girl went to her room, and Kate was there. Kate saw her sister come in with a sheep's head. "Ah, what happened to you, my dear sister?" "Bah," she said sadly. "This is my mother's doing," she says. "I know it. I knew that she had a black heart, and I knew that she had it in for you, but I never thought she would do something as wicked and evil as this. Come, dear sister, you're not safe here. We're going to run away." So she wrapped up her sister's head in bandages, so that no one could see that she had a sheep's head. And then she put a shawl around her, with a hood on it, up over the head so that it kept it hidden. She packed a few bits and pieces, and then, hand in hand, the two of them set off, and walked and walked and walked right across the kingdom where they lived. They walked into another kingdom, and they walked right across that one too, and into a third kingdom. And after a while of walking, Kate saw a castle on the hill. Well, being a princess, where else would she go but a castle? She headed straight towards it. She knocked on the door, and she said, "I've come a long, long way. I'm looking for work. Is there anything that I can do in the castle? I have a sister here with me who's very ill." "Oh dear," they said. "Well, I'm sure there's always jobs to do in the kitchen." "Oh, I would be delighted to work in the kitchen," she said. So they took her in, they gave him a room. And poor Anne, with her sheep's head, she stayed in the room, but Kate Crackernuts went down and she worked in the kitchen. She peeled the tatties, she cut up vegetables, she washed pots and washed dishes. She did everything, swept the floor, kept the fire going, and everybody liked her. She was a very likeable young woman. Well, there is something, though, that Kate had noticed. The castle was not a happy place. There was a great gloom hung over it, a sadness. And she said to the cook, "Why is there such a sad atmosphere in this place? What's wrong with it?" "Oh, that'll be the prince," said the cook. "The prince? What about the prince?" "Well, he's very ill. He's been very ill for a long time. He's been lying in his bed for ages." And there's something that happens at night, we don't know what, because nobody would dare stay in the room all night with the prince. But there's something that happens, and every morning he just seems to get that bit worse. He's dying, and we don't know why. Has anybody not spent the night in the room? Well, people are scared, you see. They think it's witchcraft. There's magic afoot here. Nobody would dare go in. Their life would be lost if they spent the night there. The king would offer anything for anyone that would stay there. Well, I'll stay there, said Kate. Yeah, I'd spend the night in the room with the prince. Would you? Oh, yes. Well, we'd better send you up to see the king. So she went up to see the king. And the king said, I hear that you are prepared to spend the night in the room with my son. Yes, I am, she said. And what would you take for such a dangerous task as that? A bag of silver coins, she said. No problem, said the king. It will be yours. So, that night, Kate was taken up to the bedchamber where the prince lay on his bed. And there was a good fire roaring. And she took a handful of nuts out of the pocket of her apron, and she started to crack the nuts and eat them, and throw the shells in the fire. Well, the night passed, and nothing happened. The king was lying, the prince was lying asleep, sound asleep on the bed. And then the clock struck midnight. And when the clock struck midnight, the prince's eyes opened. He sat up. He swung his legs out the bed. He stood up. He dressed. And he ran out the door and down a side stairway. Kate followed him. He didn't seem to know that she was there. He went across the yard to the stable. Kate followed him. He went into the stable and he got his horse. Kate followed him there too. And he took his horse with his hunting dog and he set off to ride. Well, Kate, quick as a flash, jumped up on the horse behind him. Now, the prince was in some sort of a dream, because he wasn't even aware that Kate was there. But Kate clung on to him, and he rode fast through the night, through the green wood. And as they went through the green wood, Kate was gathering nuts off the trees as she went by. She filled her apron with nuts again. Then the prince came to a great green hill, and he went to the hill and he shouted, open up for the prince, his horse and his hound. And Kate added, and his lady behind him. And a door opened in the side of the hill, and he rode into it. And inside the hill, there was a beautiful, beautiful room. A room fit for any castle, any palace in the land. It was beautiful. And there was lots of beautiful people there, all richly dressed. Music was playing and they were dancing. The prince got down off his horse and he ran to a beautiful woman, the most strikingly beautiful woman in all the room. And she smiled and took him in her arms and she danced with him. The two of them danced all night. Kate was trying to figure out what was going on. She sat in the corner and she was listening to see if she could hear anything that would be to her advantage. She knew that this must be the fairies. This was fairy magic. Now 2 fairies were standing talking to each other, and the one said to the other, if only Kate knew that this was the queen of the fairies that was dancing with the prince, and that she intends to dance him to death. Well, as soon as Kate heard that, she knew then what was wrong with the prince. but how to fix it. She sat and she watched all night, and as soon as it got near dawn, the dancing stopped. The prince went back to his horse and chomped on it, and Kate, quick as a flash, slipped up on the back of the horse and held on tight, and the prince rode out through the open doorway and away through the green woods and back to the castle, and he was back in his bed before the sun rose. Kate had followed him all the way, and she was sitting by the side of the fire, cracking nuts and eating them. And that's where they found her the next day when the king and his men came in. "You're safe," said the king. "I am safe," she said. And she sat there cracking nuts and eating them. "What sort of a night did my son spend?" "He spent a good night," she said. "Well, I promised you a bag of silver coins if you would stay the night with him, and I am a man of my word. Here you go. I think that you may bring good luck to this castle." "Oh, I do hope so," said Kate. "Well, what would you take to spend another night with my son?" "Oh, I would take a bag of gold coins this time." "Then it will be done," said the king. And that night Kate sat in the bedroom, watched the prince, and at the stroke of midnight the clock struck 12, and the prince's eyes opened, his legs swung out of bed, he got dressed, he went down the back stairs, he went to the stable, he got his horse and his hound, and he set off through the night. Kate was with him every step of the way, sitting behind him on the horse and gathering nuts off the trees as they went past. They got to the hill, and again the prince said, open up for the prince with his horse and his hound, and his lady behind him," said Kate. And the door of the hill opened, and the two of them rode in, and there was the fairy dance, and the queen greeted him, and she danced him, and if she had danced him hard the night before, she danced him twice as hard that night. Kate sat there cracking nuts by the side of the fire and listening to what was going on, what people were saying. Again, there was two fairies standing nearby talking to each other. And she could see that there was a fairy child sitting on the opposite side of the fire, and it was playing with a magic wand. And she heard the one fairy say to the other, if only Kate knew that 2 strokes of that wand would cure her sick sister. So when she heard that, she started to roll nuts across the floor towards the little fairy child. The fairy child dropped the wand to pick up the nuts, and as quick as a flash, Kate took the wand and put it in her apron pocket and waited until it was getting near dawn, when the dancing stopped and the prince left, and she followed him. And they rode all the way back to the castle and back to his bed, and she sat by the side of the fire. And when the king came in, he said, "Oh, you're safe. I am pleased. What sort of a night did my son spend?" "He spent a good night," said Kate. "Well, what could I give you to stay another night with the prince?" "Oh, well," she says, "you've given me silver and you've given me gold. There's only one thing that you can give me that's worth more than that." "And what's that, my dear?" "The prince's hand in marriage," she says. "I'll have him for a husband." "Well, that's agreed," he says. "You've earned it." So she bade goodbye to the king, and she ran back to the room where her sister Anne was as quick as she could. And she took the fairy wand out of her pocket. She unwrapped the bandages around poor Anne's head, her sheep's head, and then she tapped it 3 times. Tap, tap, tap on the head with the magic wand. And the sheep's head fell off her shoulders, and her own bonny head leapt up from who knows where, and jumped back up onto her neck, and she was as good as new, and twice as beautiful. She was so happy she took Kate in her arms and she hugged her as her dearest, dearest sister. Well, that night Kate was ready, went to the prince's bedchamber and sat cracking nuts by the side of the fire. When the clock struck midnight, the prince got out of bed, down the back stairs, crossed the yard, into the stable, and got his horse and his hound. Well, Kate was there with him every step of the way, jumped up on the back behind him. They rode through the green woods. She gathered nuts as she went and filled her apron pocket. And then they got to the hill, and the prince said, open up, for the prince, his horse and his hound, and his lady behind him," said Kate. And the two of them rode in through the door, and again the queen of the fairies greeted him, and danced him, and danced him, and danced him. Now, Kate was sitting by the fire, cracking nuts and eating them again, and she saw that the same fairy child was there, the same one she had seen the night before with the wand. Only this time it had a beautiful coloured bird with it, and it was playing with the bird. And then she heard the two fairies talking again, and the one fairy said to the other, "If Kate only knew, 3 bites of that bird, and the prince would be cured, the spell would be broken." Well, she rolled nuts across the floor to the fairy child, and it dropped the bird. She took the bird, twisted its neck, and put it into her apron pocket. And when it was near dawn, and the prince left, she was with him. And they rode back to the castle, and the prince went back to his bed, and Kate followed him. And then she plucked the bird, and she put it on a spit over the fire, and she started to roast it. And soon the smell of roast bird was filling the room. And the prince's eyes started to flicker open, and he went, that smell," he said. "Oh, if only I had a bite of that bird." So Kate came running over to him with the bird, and she gave it to him, and he took a bite and ate it and swallowed it. And then he got up on one elbow, and he said, "Oh, if only I had another bite of that bird." So she gave him a second bite of the bird, and he became stronger, and he sat up in bed and went, if only I had a third bite of that bird." And so Kate gave him another bite of the bird, and he jumped out of bed. The spell was broken, and he was as good as new. He didn't know what had been happening, so Kate told him everything. And he took her in his arms, and he kissed her, and he thanked her for what she'd done for him. And he was more than happy about marrying her, because she was a beautiful girl, and brave and loyal and true. So the next morning, when the king came into the room, there the two of them sat, Kate and the prince, and they were both cracking nuts, and both of them were eating him. The king was delighted. He took Kate and his son in his arms, and he said that he was glad now to have a daughter as well as sons, because he had 2 sons, you see. And so Kate was married to the ill prince, who was now well. And Kate's sister Anne married the well prince. So the well sister married the sick prince, and the sick sister married the well prince, and the 2 of them lived happily with their husbands in the castle for the rest of their days. This is a story from the island of Straumsey in Orkney. It's called The Man from Nowhere. Now, there was a farmer in Straumsey, and his farm wasn't doing so well. It was a big farm, and it had been very prosperous and very successful, but they had had such a run of bad luck. Everything was going wrong. Now, one evening, there was a knock at the door, and when the farmer opened it, he saw a stranger standing there. A handsome man, but a stranger to him. "I wonder," said the stranger, "if you have any work that I could do." "Well," he said, "there's plenty of work needed on the farm, right enough, but, we've had such a run of bad luck that it's really, I don't know if we've got enough money to hire anyone else." Now, the farmer's mother was sitting in the corner, and she was looking at this stranger, and it was known that she was a wise woman. And she said, "Leave him alone and give him a job. I think that he's got a lucky look about him. I think that he would do well." So the farmer, knowing that his mother was a wise woman, accepted and took him on. Now the stranger said to the farmer, "There is one thing I would like to ask." "Yes?" "I want to eat all my meals in private, alone." "Well, I suppose so. That's all. So, the next day the man set about working, and the work that man could do, it was more than a dozen men. He was amazing. Everything was just being done in no time at all. And that night, he took his meal and he went into his own room and he closed the door and locked it. Now, he came out later and he said to the farmer, "That's not enough food. I need more food than that." Well, the farmer was so impressed with him that he decided that he was worth the extra food, so he gave him some more and he went back to his room. Now, the next day he was working just as hard as before, and that evening he got twice as much food as everyone else, and he went to his chamber and locked the door. Now, he was a very popular young man there. A lot of the other servants, they all liked him, all except for one, who was a lazy, nasty, shiftless creature. And he had no time for him at all. But the one thing that all the servants wondered was, why does he eat on his own? Why doesn't he eat with everyone else? And one night, one of them sneaked over to the man's room and he peeked through the keyhole. And he could see the man sitting there with the food in front of him, and he was eating away just normally. But every now and again he would pass a piece of food over his shoulder, and he would say, "That's for you, Alec. This one's for you, Cork. That's for you, Tring." And invisible hands would snatch the food and take it away. And they started to say, "He's in league with the fairies. That must be the Trows. He's feeding." And so people thought, well, he's in league with the fairies. We'd better be careful. We'd better not annoy him. All except for that lazy, useless servant who still didn't believe anything to do with this man. If he didn't believe he was in league with the fairies, he didn't like him. He was jealous of him, basically. He was popular. He was handsome. The girl smiled at him. He didn't like that. Well, the next day they'd gone to the fishing, and they'd got a good load of fish. But a strange thing happened, because when they reached the shore, they found that the boat was so heavy they couldn't drag it up to the boat nest. So the farmer sent more men back to the farm to get ropes and get more men to come down and pull the boat up. But the stranger stepped forward and said, "I can do this for you, but you have to leave me alone to do it." Knowing what he was like, they all turned around and walked away. And just after no time at all, the man came running up after them and said, "The boat's up in the nest and ready to be shored up." And sure enough, there it was, pulled up into the boat now, safe and sound. Well, this was quite some servant the man had, and he knew it. And the harvest was brought in record time. and it was, well known that he had a whole host of fairies working for him. They knew nothing about the man, though, and even when they asked him, quizzed him about who he was, where he came from, he wouldn't give any answer at all. It was just as if he'd come from nowhere. Now, one night, getting towards winter, that useless servant, the nasty one, the one that always gave this man from nowhere a hard time, he was coming home late one night. And as he walked along the road, bang! Somebody hit him on the side of the head and knocked him into the ditch. He sprung up with his fists up, ready to fight his attacker, but he couldn't see anyone there, and bang! An uppercut caught him under the chin and sent him sprawling. And then a whole lot of fists and feet rained down on him, and he was kicked and punched till he was able to scramble up to his feet and run back to the farmhouse as fast as he could, being kicked and punched all the way. He burst through the door, and the people were shocked because he was all battered and bruised. And when they asked who had done this, he said he had no idea. He hadn't seen anyone. They all thought that this was remarkable. The man from nowhere stood at this corner of the room, smiling, a dark smile on his face. And he must have been settling old scores, they reckoned. That servant had been horrible to him, and he was paid back. But the next day, that man from nowhere was nowhere to be found. He had gone just as mysteriously as he had arrived. The servant who had been attacked, he recovered. And, he was a much more humble man after that. But the farmer, he missed his servant because he was a good servant. But the thing was, his luck had changed, and now everything went well with the farm, and so he never had to worry about that again, and bad luck never crossed his threshold after that.